mystical green beanie.
Hey, what's going on, dudes and dudettes? I am the mystical green beanie. So I saw Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse recently, and I know I typically do best of, worst of reviews for movies and TV shows and such, but I'm not really in a best of, worst of mood right now. I kinda just want to talk about this movie as a Spider-Man fan. Now, when this film was first announced, it had a lot going against it in my case. First and foremost, it was pitched as a Miles Morales film, and I think I've made my views on Miles very clear, but I'll talk about that more later. And then the title was announced, and it was revealed to be a movie about the Spider-Verse. And I don't think I've talked about that on the channel in depth outside of maybe one or two videos, but I hate the Spider-Verse. I hate it. I hate it. For me, it's the worst thing to happen to Spider-Man in the past 10 years. Yeah, even more so than One More Day. And I am more than willing to defend that point. But then the trailers dropped, and I was absolutely over the moon for the first one onward. And then the movie came out, and I loved it. In fact, while it's not my ideal Spider-Man movie, A, that's okay because I got my ideal Spider-Man movie with Spider-Man PS4, and B, this movie feels like a wonderfully crafted love letter to Spider-Man and Spider-Man fans, and I really dug it for that. So, without further ado, let's get into some talking points. First and foremost, I want to talk about Miles, who was the POV character for this film. I freaking loved Miles in this movie. Now, like I said earlier, Miles is a very frustrating character because he's such a hotbed of wasted potential. Alright, check it out. Imagine a kid growing up in a world full of superheroes and then inheriting the powers of one of the most beloved heroes in all the world, but then witnessing that hero die in action with the guilt of knowing that they had the power to save them but they did nothing. And from there, to atone for their mistake, they do all that they can to live up to that hero's legacy by taking up their mantle. Now, doesn't that sound cool? Don't answer. It's a rhetorical question. I know it sounds cool. But the sad part is, the last time any story that took full advantage of the story potential that Miles had was 5 years ago. Which was 2 years after Miles was created. Yeah. But this movie does that while also giving Miles his own sense of identity and allowing the character to live up to the promise that was given in the comics, where he was told to not do it like Peter, but to do it like he wants to do it. And that's really important. So Miles in this movie is very different from his comic book counterpart. In fact, he's a bit of a reinvention from the ground up, and I think that suits the character perfectly. In fact, if anything, it does him more favors than anything else, because one of the major drawbacks to Miles in the comics is that he's basically a reskin of Peter Parker, no pun intended, but admittedly it works pretty well. But seriously, he's a carbon copy of Peter Parker, except he has Gank as a best friend. Literally, if you made him white, there would be little, if any, distinction between him and the Peter Parker from Spider-Man Homecoming. But in this movie, they change a lot about his character while also keeping a lot of the core elements of his comic book origins from Bendis and Bichelli's original origin from Ultimate Spider-Man. And one of the simple yet brilliant changes made is that in the movie, Miles is an artist. I mean, it's hinted at here and there that he's really smart and good at math and science, but his bread and butter is drawing and painting. And that one alteration adds a whole new dimension to his character and does a great job of making him more distinct from Peter Parker, because it opens him up more socially while also keeping some of the awkwardness of being a teenager that's inherent to the DNA of Spider-Man, but also making it different enough to where it feels unique to Miles. Plus it informs his costume change later on in the film, which I loved, by the way, because he's given the classic Spider-Man costume and he paints over it, signifying his growth as his own Spider-Man and him doing the job his own way. And I gotta admit, I like that way more than the comic book version where he's just given a fancy new suit from S.H.I.E.L.D. I also wanted to talk about how this film does the Spider-Verse concept while not doing it in a way that turns Spider-Man into Superman. So, alright, look. A few years ago, there was a comic called Spider-Verse. It was written by Dan Slott, and the majority of the art was done by Olivier Coipel and Giuseppe Camuncoli. And it was kind of like the spiritual successor to the video game Spider-Man Shattered Dimensions, which was also written by Dan Slott. And I absolutely hated Spider-Verse. Now, as a video game, it worked because it's a video game, and that type of storytelling works in that medium. But when Dan tried to do the same thing in comics, he took it way too far. I'm sorry, but having Spider-Man literally be the center of the multiverse and telling a meta story in which Spider-Man is revealed to be the most important character in all of Marvel's pantheon, who's under threat from these immortal cosmic vampires, really rubs me the wrong way. Because that's the kind of story that you tell with Superman. Spider-Man is all about being just a guy who happens to run into crazy stuff or have crazy stuff happen to him. And this movie takes the Spider-Verse concept and does it a million times better by not making Spider-Man the center of all creation, but by acknowledging that while there are certainly other Spider-Men out there, Spider-Man himself isn't the center of everything, and Peter Parker isn't the end-all be-all. Because anyone can be Spider-Man, and at the end of the day, that's kind of the point. You know, the more I think about it, the more I think that this movie is more akin to the Spider-Man miniseries that was written and drawn by Brian Michael Bendis and Sarah Pichelli, at least in terms of the way the story goes about treating the whole multidimensional Spider-Man aspect, because it approaches the concept less operatically and goes for a more, well, this is random, but, you know, let's go on a crazy adventure together type thing. I don't know how to phrase what I'm thinking. But the point that I'm trying to make is that it ties in all of these different Spider people while not making Spider-Man Jesus. And I really appreciated that. However, that being said, if this movie gets a sequel, I'd much rather we didn't do anything with the Spider-Verse. In fact, I'd prefer a standalone movie with Miles as Spider-Man doing the best that he can to live up to the mantle of Spider-Man. But that's just me. Then there's the different Peter Parkers who are also really cool. First off, I want to mention that I seriously think that having the Peter Parker of Miles' dimension be blonde was more than just a device to differentiate him from the older, more broken Peter, and that was actually a Ben Reilly Easter egg. Or maybe it wasn't. I don't know. But that was the first thing that came to mind when I saw it. Anyways, I thought it was pretty cool having the Peter of Miles' world be so accomplished and die in his prime, because that's what separates the Peter of that world from the more jaded world-weary Peter Parker. Because Old Man Peter, has gone through his prime, and he hit a decline. Hard. And I like how that informs his attitude, because when watching the trailers, I was a little put off by the fact that he was as much of a douchebag as he was, but as it turns out, he's just like that because he's broken. You know, this is a Peter Parker who's fallen out of love with being Spider-Man. He's had to bury Aunt May. He and MJ have drifted apart, and now he's just this hollow shell of his former self. And it's really sad, but completely understandable how he got to where he is. But I also appreciate that in spite of his angst, he's still Spider-Man. Because once Miles hits him with that power responsibility phrase and tells him the severity of the situation and the stakes, though reluctant, Peter agrees to do the right thing, because that's what Spider-Man does. And throughout the film, Peter not only finds himself once again, but he learns to trust Miles and let him be his own Spider-Man, even though I think that arc was a bit rushed, but I'll talk about that more later. Also, I just want to point out that I really appreciated seeing Peter hit rock bottom as hard as he does after he and MJ split up, because it gives consequences to a life choice like that in a way that we didn't see in the comics with Brand New Day, which is also one of my biggest problems with Brand New Day, among other things, but that was certainly one of the big ones. Oh, and I also wanted to talk about the villains, because the main ones are the Kingpin, Doc Ock, and Tombstone. but with an asterisk next to Tombstone's name, because he's more of a lackey than anything else, and that kind of sucks, because I feel like Tombstone can be so much more, but nobody ever really does anything with him. But, you know, it's whatever. Sometimes like that it be. But just as a Spider-Man fanboy, I don't think that I can communicate to rational human beings my levels of excitement in seeing the Kingpin in a Spider-Man movie as the main antagonist. Because that's always what I've wanted to see. Kingpin as the big bad guy while he employs the other Spider-Man rogues gallery to do his bidding. And that's how you incorporate Doc Ock and Scorpion and Prowler and Tombstone and the Green Goblin, even though he dies literally in the first 20 minutes of the movie, and so on and so on. It's the thing that Nolan started with The Dark Knight, and nobody else besides the Russos, when working on Winter Soldier, learned, and it's that you can have multiple villains in a comic book movie, you just need to establish a villain hierarchy, and this movie does just that. In fact, it's funny, I'm still debating whether or not to make this video, but I wrote this video script for how I would have done Spider-Man Homecoming, and this movie does what I did there, where I established a big-time mob boss as the main villain, although in my movie it's the Big Man, and here it's the Kingpin, and his underlings are villains for hire, and that leaves you with an easy out to incorporate as many Spider-Man villains as you want in one movie. Okay, maybe not as many villains as you want, but you get the idea. Plus, did I mention that the Kingpin is the main antagonist of a Spider-Man movie? I did? Oh. Sorry for the redundancy, I'm really excited. One of my last videos I did was actually me talking about the Kingpin and how I'm glad that he's being more and more positioned as a Spider-Man villain once again. Also, his motivation for doing what he does was really well handled. He apparently buys Alchemex and has them build Hadrian time-space portal so that he can save his wife and son, Vanessa and Richard. Although, one thing I'll say is that it's weird that the Rose apparently exists in this universe where Richard Fisk is dead. Because Richard Fisk was the Rose. Well, for a while at least, but he wasn't at first. So maybe it's the other guy, I don't know. Wait, where was I going with this? I don't remember. Anyways, I like how the ideals of Spider-Man and the Kingpin are shown in contrast with each other, where Wilson's family dies because he's caught by them doing a criminal act, which they apparently didn't know that he was the Kingpin, I think, but I'll get to that later. And then they die in a car crash, and now he's doing everything that he can to bring them back. And he kills Spider-Man out of anger because Peter, of course, has been through this. You know, watching a loved one die as a result of a mistake that he made. And when Peter tries to tell him to move on and accept responsibility for his actions, and that they're gone, and that he should move on, Kingpin gets frustrated and he lashes out and murders him, and that was really cool. Also, Doc Ock was here, and she's really fun, and I have a hunch as to why Doc Ock was Rule 63'd, and I think it's for two reasons. The first is that it's to further draw any distance between Miles' universe and Old Man Peter's. Secondly, I think it's a reference to Doc Ock from the Shattered Dimensions video game, and I think it's more so the latter than the former, even though it could be both, because in the game, that Doc Ock works for Alchemex, and so does this one. But yeah, she was great. I love the design of her tentacles. God, that might be the greatest out of context sentence that I've said just yet. And from a practicality perspective, it just makes more sense for the arms to be squishy, because they're constantly extending and retracting, and it's just a really cool, unique design that I found myself drawn to, and it was really different and really out there. But at the same time, she never didn't feel like Doc Ock, because her whole thing is being a sadistic mad scientist, and she 100% felt like classic Doc Ock, and I bought it. Also, and this is just a quick aside, I love the Scorpion's redesign. I know some people don't, and I get it, but I thought it was a really cool mashup between the classic cyborg Scorpion and the Ultimate Universe Mexican cartel Scorpion. But again, that's just me. One thing that I will say is that this movie felt a bit short, because while it is just under 2 hours, and honestly, not every film needs to be longer than that, there were certain things that I felt required further explanation. Not to me, but to other people just in case. For example, as a comic book fan, I know that the Kingpin is a big-time gangster who doubles as a businessman, but there was no mention of that, or his status in New York for that matter, to indicate his relationship to the city. Also, Miles and Peter's respective arcs feel not so much rushed, but it feels like there was a light bulb moment for Miles where he goes from not getting it to 100% getting it, and it happens between Peter telling him to go home and then him going to the Hadron Collider. He just felt a bit too in control of his powers and confident in his ability to be Spider-Man for my liking. Meanwhile, Peter goes through 2 arcs, and the first one I can sort of buy him completing as soon as he does, and that's the call to action and him realizing that he needs to get off his ass and get back in gear and stop acting like such a washed up failure. But the second is allowing Miles to be his own Spider-Man. And I feel like there's a conversation missing between he and Miles, and it just felt off to me, and I would have liked to see them spend more time together. Also, I would have liked to see how Peter and Gwen deal with seeing each other alive, because on Gwen's Earth, her origin is that Peter dies, and she's kind of the one who kills him? Sorta? Ish? She's partially responsible. And of course, Peter would feel awkward around Gwen because, well. And, I don't know, I feel like there should have been a conversation there like there was in the Spider-Verse comic. Ugh. I can't believe I just said that. Oh, and before I forget, the animation is stellar. Wait, seriously, how did I forget to mention that? That of all things. Okay, sure, whatever. But the animation style is really dynamic and mimics the paneling style of comic book storytelling, and I absolutely love that idea. Same with the inner monologue captions. Those did a great job of getting us into the head of Miles, which I know was a very tricky thing to do in the medium of film and TV, but I feel like the directors did a great job finding a way around that. And the different art styles for each of the different Spider-Men and Spider-Women I thought was really great. And I found it hilarious how Spider-Man Noir comes from a world where color doesn't exist. Also, Peter Parker looks like an anime character when everyone else, well, excluding Spider-Ham, has, relatively speaking, more humanistic proportions and interactions and reactions. The use of onomatopoeia and motion lines and thought bubbles and all that really evoke the style of comic book storytelling, and I know that other films have tried to do this, but outside of Scott Pilgrim vs. the World, this is the only other one that I felt does it well. And the cell shading gave the characters and the world such a dynamic sense of dynamicness. The movie was pretty. Yeah, it was very pretty, and you can tell that a lot of hard work went into, putting this onto the screen, and it really shows. But yeah, this movie's amazing. Heck, I'd say it's spectacular. It's the ultimate Spider-Man film to be put to the big screen, and so far, it's my favorite silver screen adaptation of Spider-Man. I mean, the bar's not all that high, in my opinion. I don't like the Raimi films, and while I personally enjoy the Mark Webb duology, those movies aren't good objectively speaking. And Homecoming, while it is a good movie, and definitely in terms of having a plot where the characters have believable arcs and follow the rules of basic storytelling in film, it's kind of a bad adaptation. But this, Into the Spider-Verse is a wonderful adaptation that tells a great story. The animation is stellar, and the voice acting, oh wow, I didn't talk about the voice acting. It's phenomenal. Nicolas Cage is great as Spider-Man Noir. Haley Steinfeld is an amazing Gwen Stacy. Jake Johnson is fantastic as Peter Parker, which is funny because I hated his voice when I first heard it. And it's not even his voice that I really hate, it's more so that his voice just doesn't strike me as Peter Parker-ish, but it worked perfectly for the film. And Shameik Moore was just great as Miles. He sounds kind of like how I would imagine Miles to be in the comics, but there's a spark of life that's always absent for me that's not now. And he really did breathe life into this character who I felt has been lifeless for the majority of his existence. But yeah, this movie was wonderful. It's hands down my favorite Spider-Man film, and so far it's my third favorite Spider-Man adaptation, following Spider-Man PS4 and the Spectacular Spider-Man animated series. Well, do I even want to call this an adaptation? Because even though it's loosely adapting the first arc of all new Ultimate Spider-Man, Spider-Man, and Spider-Verse, it's not really an adaptation. It's more like a meta celebration of Spider-Man in pop culture. Because, you know, much like in the real world, in the world of Spider-Verse, there are Spider-Man comics that exist and merchandise from our world that exists. And the two respective Peter Parkers apparently have done and experienced everything the three live-action Spider-Men have, and then some. And the way Peter talks about being Spider-Man and his relationship with New York, it just feels somewhat satirical. So yeah. I don't know where that last tangent was going, but those are just my thoughts. But what about you? What did you think of the movie? Did you like it? Did you like the animation style? What did you think of the voice acting? Let me know down below in the comment section. Also, if you like this video, hit the like button, share, support the channel, and if you want to see more content like this, all you have to do is subscribe. I'm the Mystical Green Beanie. Thank you for watching, and as always, until next time, adios nachos, adios.